What you are about to step into isn't just another cold case. We're looking at what is widely considered to be one of the most gruesome, deeply puzzling, and frankly haunting crimes in European history. So settle in as we go through this explainer, because the actual facts of this true story are far darker than any fiction.
On a freezing Friday evening, March 31st, 1922, 6 people were systematically slaughtered on an isolated Bavarian farmstead. We're talking about an entire household: 63-year-old Andres Gruber, his 72-year-old wife Cecilia, their 35-year-old widowed daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 young children Cecilia and Josef, and their newly hired maid, Maria Baumgartner. It was a massacre of absolute, brutal efficiency.
But here is the detail that truly elevates this case into a psychological nightmare. If all 6 inhabitants of the farm were completely dead by the night of March 31st, why on earth was smoke seen casually rising from their chimney for days afterward?
Let's get into Part 1, Omens in the Snow. You see, the killer didn't just appear out of thin air. There was a timeline of creeping paranoia that actually began 6 months prior to the murders. That's when the family's previous maid flat out quit her job, terrified, claiming she heard strange noises in the attic and was convinced the house was haunted. Fast forward to just days before the massacre, and the dread really escalates. A set of house keys simply vanishes. A newspaper from Munich, a paper literally no one in the family subscribed to, mysteriously appears inside the home. And then, the ultimate warning sign. Just 1 day before the murders, Andres Gruber discovers footprints in the fresh snow. They led right from the dense edge of the forest directly to the farm's machine room. But here's the kicker: there were no footprints leading away.
Andreas actually told his neighbors about these tracks. He said, "The footsteps left the machine shed. They did not go back into the woods." He realized, with what must have been absolute terror, that someone had walked onto his property and never left. He even searched the attic after hearing heavy footsteps above him at night, but he found no one. A neighbor offered him a gun for protection, but Andreas, maybe out of stubborn pride, refused it. He had no idea he was already sharing his home with a phantom.
To really grasp this, we have to understand their isolation. The name Hinterkaifeck literally translates to behind Kaifeck. The farmstead was situated about 70 kilometers north of Munich, tucked away behind a small hamlet, and bordered very closely by dark, dense Bavarian woods. They were utterly alone out there, far from the eyes and ears of anyone who could possibly help them.
Which brings us to Part 2, the night of the murders.
On the afternoon of March 31st, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived. It was her very first day on the job, and tragically, it would also be her last. Late that evening, the killer executed a chillingly calculated plan. 4 members of the family, Andreas, his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria, and his 7-year-old granddaughter, were lured out to the barn one by one. Out there in the dark, they were ambushed. Once the adults and the older child were dead, the assailant moved completely silently into the house, slipping into the living quarters to murder 2-year-old Joseph right in his bassinet, and Maria, the new maid, in her bed.
Now, an absolutely crucial detail here lies in the weapon used to commit these atrocities. It wasn't a firearm, and it wasn't a simple knife. It was the family's own mattock, a heavy agricultural tool kind of like a pickaxe. And what makes this detail so incredibly chilling is that Andreas Gruber himself had specifically modified this tool, inserting a heavy nail into the blunt edge to stun pigs for slaughter. To wield a heavy tool like that indoors with such lethal precision required a lot of physical strength and a deeply controlled rage. The scene inside that barn was a literal vision of hell. The 4 victims were found stacked on top of one another, completely concealed under hay. They had been struck down in rapid succession with heavy, crushing blows to the head. But the most harrowing detail from the autopsy reports is that 7-year-old Cecilia didn't die immediately. The evidence showed she actually survived for hours in the hay, tearing her own hair out in tufts in the pitch black, just lying there next to the bodies of her family.
Let's move on to Part 3, the killer who stayed.
4 days. I want that to really sink in. That is how long it took for the bodies to be discovered. And in those 4 agonizing days, the killer didn't run. They stayed.
The sheer madness of this situation really hits you when you look at the aftermath. While 6 bodies lay bleeding out in the barn and the bedrooms, someone was playing house. The cattle and livestock were meticulously fed. The entire supply of bread in the kitchen was consumed. Fresh meat had been recently cut from the pantry. The fireplace was actively kept burning to warm the house, which, as we mentioned earlier, is exactly why neighbors casually saw smoke rising from the chimney all weekend. The killer literally made themselves at home, right in the middle of a slaughterhouse. There was even a terrifying near-miss encounter. On the night of April 1st, a passing carpenter noticed the door to the farm's bakehouse was sitting ajar. As he approached it, a large man stepped out and deliberately shined a pocket lantern directly into his eyes, completely blinding him. The passerby noticed thick smoke pouring from the oven with a revolting smell, like old rags burning, and he panicked and fled into the night. He had stood face to face with the monster of Hinterkaifeck, and he never even saw his face.
This leads us to Part 4, a botched investigation.
The truth is, the crime scene was obliterated almost immediately. Before the Munich police even arrived, curious neighbors and onlookers just wandered through the farm. They moved the bodies, and incredibly, some even cooked meals in the very kitchen the killer had just vacated. When the court physician finally got there, autopsies were performed right there in the bloody barn without any proper methodology. Desperate for leads, the police actually sought help from clairvoyants. They removed the victims' skulls and shipped them off to Munich, where, tragically, they were lost forever during the bombings of World War II.
And the erasure of Hinterkaifeck didn't stop there. Less than a year later, in 1923, the entire farmstead was completely demolished, basically to wipe the grim memory from the landscape. It was actually only during this demolition that the murder weapon, the blood-stained mattock, was finally found hidden beneath the floorboards. Today, you might be wondering why we can't just solve this with modern genetic genealogy. Well, the answer is simple. The physical record was broken at every possible node. There is simply no viable biological material left to test. The farm, the weapon's context, the skulls, they are all gone.
So let's explore Part 5, Suspects and Secrets.
You see, the Grubers were not exactly a typical innocent family. Andreas Gruber was a notoriously controlling, deeply abusive patriarch. In fact, he and his widowed daughter, Victoria, had previously been convicted of having an incestuous relationship. Because of this dark history, the paternity of 2-year-old Joseph was a massive source of tension and rumor in the village. Many people fully believed Andreas was the father, while others pointed the finger at a neighbor. So this household was already a powder keg of resentment, fear, and enemies long before that mattock swung.
Which brings us to the prime suspect for many investigators, Lorenzo Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who claimed he might be the father of young Josef. When you compare the facts, his behavior is definitely alarming. He was one of the men who actually discovered the bodies. But when he arrived, he somehow magically unlocked the front door using a key that the family had reported missing days earlier. He also handled the bodies and completely contaminated the scene. Yet, on the flip side, his defenders argue he was just frantically searching for his son. And in the sheer panic of the era, he handled the bodies out of shock, staging the discovery only to avoid looking guilty. The police investigated him thoroughly, for sure, but they could never definitively prove his guilt.
But Schlittenbauer wasn't the only ghost hovering over this story. A few alternative theories emerged too. Some heavily suspected Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband who supposedly died in World War I, although his body was never actually recovered. Could he have deserted, returned home, discovered the incestuous secret, and taken his brutal revenge? Then there were the farmhands, like the Bickler brothers and George Siegel. They knew the farm's layout intimately, they knew the family hoarded gold, and crucially, the notoriously aggressive farm dog never barked at them. Literally any of these men could have slipped into that attic and waited in the dark.
Bringing us to Part 6, the 2007 Cold Case Review.
In 2007, a group of students from a German police academy cracked open the dusty archives. Using modern criminological techniques, behavioral analysis, and profiling, they meticulously reviewed every surviving scrap of paper. And they actually came to a consensus. They identified a prime suspect, a person they believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, committed the slaughter. But in a twist that is perfectly fitting for this endlessly frustrating case, they flat out refused to publish the name. Out of respect for the suspect's living descendants, they chose to let the secret remain buried.
And that leaves us right here, staring into the dark. We know how the Groomer family was lured out to the barn. We know the killer lived among their bodies, eating their food and stoking their fire. We even know that modern investigators very likely found the answer. But with the farm demolished, the skulls lost, and the police remaining totally silent, will the true monster of Hinterkaifeck ever be officially named? Or are they destined to remain forever, just footsteps in the attic and smoke rising from a chimney in the freezing Bavarian woods?